Today's video is sponsored by our longtime friends over at Squarespace. Thank you, Squarespace. You make amazing websites with them. I'll tell you more about them later. It's among the greatest scientific and military achievements that humankind has ever endeavored to accomplish. In 33 years of service, it became an iconic symbol of Cold War scientific competition and the United States' reputation for black budget innovation. It's an expression of engineering genius, the brainchild of a true savant of aeronautics, an earth-shaking development in the world of intelligence. It, of course, is the Lockheed SR-71 Blackbird, and most of all, it's really fast. So in this episode of Mega Projects, we'll finally dive into the much-requested SR-71, a series of 32 planes that broke every boundary that its creators could imagine. We're going to explore the innovation and groundbreaking process that led to the Blackbird's construction, examine its extraordinary capabilities, and dig into an operational career that broke records that are still untouched to this very day. More than anything else, the Cold War was ultimately a war of intelligence in which the side that could collect more important secrets more quickly would gain a massive advantage. Prior to the advent of spy satellites, the best and most effective way to gather intelligence was to do it via the use of planes, and the U-2, a slow-moving, extremely high-altitude aircraft designed by the Lockheed Company, was the United States' preferred plane for that job. First introduced in 1956, the U-2 had a service ceiling of 24 kilometers high. That's some 80,000 feet, meaning that it was far higher than most enemy planes or missiles could reach. If it couldn't be reached, it couldn't be shot down, and if it couldn't be shot down, then the Soviets could do nothing to stop the U-2 from gathering all of the intel that they wanted. Well, that all changed in 1960 when a U-2 piloted by CIA operative Gary Powers was disabled by Soviet surface-to-air missiles over the city of Sverdlovsk. Not only was Powers captured by the Soviets, but his plane, including the top-secret contents of its camera, were now in Soviet possession. That was a catastrophe for the US, because not only did it allow the Soviets to figure out exactly what the Americans were looking at, but it allowed them to expose the U-2's design flaws and find a way to consistently shoot it down. Luckily for the United States, though, a solution was on the way even before Powers and his plane were shot down. The U-2 had been developed by a secretive advanced group working at Lockheed, known as Skunk Works, who had long made it their mission to create aircraft that people couldn't have even conceived before they saw it in the skies above them. Now, let me interrupt today's video. Very important announcement, and that is that the fantastic sponsor of today's video is Squarespace. And maybe you've never seen me do a Squarespace ad before, in which case, welcome to seeing the first ever video that I've ever made. Thank you, Squarespace, for your long-term support. Look, Squarespace is an all-in-one platform that allows you to build your brand and grow your business online. You can create a beautiful website, engage with your audience, and you can even sell them stuff if you want to, from products to content, even your time. Now look, I've used Squarespace to make websites. They are very easy. You go along using my link below, don't forget that, and you choose a template, you swap in some pictures, you put up some text, and you hit a publish button. You give them a little bit of money, of course, it's a business after all, and then they're like, huzzah, you have a beautiful web presence. It's just like that. It is that easy. I know nothing about coding. I know even less about design. That's a lie. I know nothing about either of those things. But coding, it's like, I wouldn't even know where to begin. Design, at least I'll be like, well, let's start with a box. Plus, there's loads of extra features. One I particularly like is email campaigns. I used to pay a company a lot of money to do email newsletters and stuff, where you like send people a thing like, hey, check out the latest news. And for some reason, that costs hundreds of dollars. And then Squarespace are like, no, we include that. That's all part of the deal. So that's a good deal. Plus, there's all the other stuff you'd expect. Analytics is a good one, so you can know who's visiting your site, what they're up to. That's handy. Plus, if you're looking for a way to give back, maybe you've got a heart of gold. Well, you can collect donations on Squarespace through PayPal, Apple Pay, Stripe, Venmo, and support your cause and raise awareness through your website. But wait, there's even more. They've got blogging tools, ways to share on your socials, and all of that brilliant stuff. So head to squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you are ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/megaprojects to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or a domain. That's right. Squarespace is offering a special promo code just for you, Peter. So use the promo code MEGAPROJECTS to get started today. Thanks to Squarespace for sponsoring, and now back to today's video. Under the leadership of an engineer named Clarence Kelly Johnson, the group had put together the U-2. But the project they'd started afterward was on a whole other level. In 1957, Lockheed had been approached by the CIA with what most people would have considered to be an impossible request: to build a spy plane that could not be detected, could not be intercepted, and could not be shot down. Luckily for the CIA, the folks over at Skunk Works are not now and have never been most people, and they got straight to work on an initiative that they dubbed Project Archangel. Now, when the CIA referred to a plane that could not be detected, what they were referring to was a plane with an extremely small radar cross-section. Now, we're used to these sorts of planes today. Take the American F-22 or the Chinese J-20. But at the time, this was a very new concept, one that the Scientific Engineering Institute had just begun investigating in their own attempts to make a better aircraft than the U-2. What the Institute realized was that if a plane could fly at extremely high altitudes or extremely high speeds, either option could reduce its radar cross-section. But if a plane could do both, then it was at a huge advantage. And further, if the plane could be built in a way that absorbed or deflected radar rather than sending it directly back to its source, then that plane could hypothetically become pretty damn close to invisible. Now, Skunk Works competed for a bid from the CIA alongside the Convair Corporation, which was responsible for the supersonic B-58 Hustler bomber. The Skunk Works design, originally referred to as the U-3, had a few key criteria. It would have to be able to cruise at no less than Mach 3, that is 3 times the speed of sound, with a range of 4,000 miles at altitudes at or above 90,000 feet. That's 17 miles above the surface of the Earth. The CIA added in a couple of other requirements: a 500-pound payload for reconnaissance equipment, and the requirements that the plane reach a radius of 2,000 nautical miles with no need to refuel. But Kelly Johnson's early attempts to work with his team and design a U-3 plane repeatedly had to be discarded. It was achievable enough to develop a plane that could meet the altitude and speed requirements, but it was the radar signature that was still a thorn in Johnson's side. On the 23rd of April 1958, Johnson took a different tack in his daily pencil sketches, this time opting for a design with a long, thin, tapered airframe and a cylindrical cross-section drawing back to 2 engines tucked closely to the fuselage and a pair of rhomboid squared-off wings. Although he didn't know it at the time, that day's design would eventually form the basis for the SR-71, and as the Skunk Works team began working with the concept, they started tweaking its specifications and establishing different configurations. This required a great deal of technological innovation from the team, and over the course of the design, they often would have to incorporate technologies that nobody had even built yet. As Kelly Johnson put it, quote, "Everything had to be invented. Everything." These designs, referred to as Archangel 1, Archangel 2, and so forth, later got shortened to the A series. And when Skunk Works had finally worked their way to the A-10 design, they began to get a sense that they had the plane they needed. The A-10 met all the CIA's requirements except the radar cross-section, but the CIA had the connections and resources to draw on a much wider range of American innovators than Skunk Works had access to. With the modifications the CIA was able to procure, the plane's radar cross-section was reduced by 90%, and for a price tag of $96 million, the CIA and Skunk Works shook hands on a deal that would produce a dozen planes of the Archangel line. Their final prototype designation, the A-12, would be their name for the foreseeable future. Skunk Works built 13 copies of their A-12, which were shipped off to Groom Lake, also known as Area 51 in the state of Nevada, for testing. On the 26th of April, the first flight-ready prototype hurled itself into the sky for the first time. To hear Kelly Johnson tell it after the fact, the test was a bit of a nail-biter, because once airborne, the plane started oscillating badly, and at one point, it disappeared into a cloud of dust, leaving the engineers on the ground panicked as to what exactly was going on. When the plane landed and could be picked apart, the problem wasn't exactly hard to find. Some of the equipment inside had been put in backwards. Despite the ignominious start, the good folks at Skunk Works were actually more than capable of fixing the problem once they found it, and with everything pointing in the right direction, it turned out that the plane flew a lot better. Surprise, surprise. The subsequent test flights went just fine, and more prototypes were produced. The numbers it generated blew past even the initial expectations of the CIA. According to Lockheed, when the A-12's test pilots were trying to push it to its limit, they were able to bring the plane to a top speed of 2,221 miles per hour. That's 3.35 times the speed of sound, and fly it as high as 95,000 feet. Individual pilots anecdotally reported having gotten it to go even faster, although these sorts of in-flight claims couldn't be verified. Skunk Works also built two variants of the A-12, including the YF-12, which was intended to be a missile-armed interceptor craft, and a version meant to carry drones. A fun fact about the YF-12, by the way, is that the plane would have to have been missile-armed because it flew several hundred miles an hour faster than bullets from an onboard cannon would have been capable of moving. Now, the A-12 was initially planned to be the final aircraft that the CIA ended up with. That's why Skunk Works was building so many prototype versions. They were supposed to be pretty close to the finished product. In fact, the A-12 was flown in missions over Vietnam and North Korea fairly early on, but in 1962, the US Air Force had some changes that they wanted to make. Although they liked the capabilities of the A-12 a lot more than the next best option, the XB-70 Valkyrie, they ordered a modified version to include some of what the Air Force needed. This included a longer fuselage, a two-seater cockpit, and some different sensor equipment. 13 A-12 planes would eventually be retired by 1968 because despite some inherent trade-offs caused by the Air Force's modifications, the plane it produced still did the A-12's job very well. This new plane would become the SR-71 Blackbird that we know today, and in order to focus both budget and resources, the SR-71 took over where the A-12 left off. 32 copies of the SR-71 aircraft were eventually produced, 29 versions of the main production variant, 2 trainers, and a hybrid trainer called the Bastard, which took the rear fuselage of the A-12's fighter variant and grafted it onto the forward SR-71 fuselage that had been used for static testing on the ground. This fleet of 32 would be the only Blackbirds ever produced, and in 1968, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara ordered that the machinery used to create the planes would be destroyed at the end of production. These 32 would be the only 32, and as long as they were invisible as advertised, they were all America would ever need. So, what exactly was the finished product Skunk Works had created? In short, it was a masterpiece. Sleek, seamless, and almost organic looking in shape, the Blackbird was light years ahead of any other plane that existed at that point. The most critical aspect of the Blackbird was its survivability at the extreme altitudes and speeds that it reached, and the most basic problem it faced was friction. Traveling through the air as fast as the Blackbird did, the plane's surface got so hot that it would have melted a conventional airframe. In order to deal with that problem, the plane was constructed out of a titanium alloy that was strong, lightweight, and more temperature resistant than nearly any other metal. It was also a royal pain to deal with and had to be shaped with specially designed tools also made out of titanium. To make matters worse, the US didn't even have enough titanium, but the CIA solved that particular problem by procuring titanium ore from the Soviet Union in a covert effort that could probably be its own mega projects video. Use the comments. With that problem dealt with, Skunk Works was able to complete the titanium outer layer, which was then coated in the plane's iconic black paint in order to absorb heat. The plane's skin was also corrugated instead of smooth, allowing it to expand or flex instead of splitting at these temperatures, and when the plane was on the ground, its fuselage panels actually didn't fit together particularly well. They were built to align only when extremely hot due to thermal expansion, which caused them to leak fuel when on the tarmac. The outer windshield was made of quartz and fused directly onto the airframe, and it would typically get as hot as 600 degrees Fahrenheit when landing. And then there's the engines. In order to meet the CIA's requirements for a plane that could fly at Mach 3 continuously, the Blackbird couldn't rely on afterburner technology. After all, those only worked for a short time, whereas the Blackbird was expected to fly at those speeds for multiple hours. The engines Skunk Works went with, two Pratt & Whitney J58 turbojets, were an innovation in themselves and produced 32,500 pound-force of static thrust. That sort of equated to just bolting a rocket onto the Blackbird's back, and because of the combination of these engines and the SR-71's unique airflow management system, the plane was actually more fuel efficient around Mach 3.2 or even faster than it was at lower speeds. Technically speaking, the engines could even make the plane go faster than that, with their only real constraint being that the air in the engine compressor became too hot well before the Blackbird reached its true speed limit. Now, as one might imagine, strapping what seemed to be essentially rockets onto an airframe makes the craft hard to slow down, and while the Blackbird used specialized tires and drag chutes when it touched down. In order to make the plane run, skunkworks also had to use specialized exotic fuel, and although coal slurries and cryogenic hydrogen were a no-go, a custom jet fuel known as JP7 was mixed in with the compound triethylborane. This combination produced the Blackbird's characteristic green flame out of the engines. It was built to have an extremely high ignition point, so that the in-flight friction on the plane's surface couldn't cause an explosion, and ground crew chiefs were known to show off by tossing lit matches and cigarettes into the Blackbird's fuel, only for the flames to extinguish it. Once it was in the air, the SR-71 would typically have to be refueled after about 90 minutes, and to spend a third of its fuel load just to get altitude. In order to refuel the planes, tanker jets had to fly almost as fast as they could using specialized equipment that again had to be built just for the Blackbird. And not only was the Blackbird's design visually stunning, but it was even better than the A-12 at hiding its radar profile. Despite the plane's massive size, it would show up on Soviet radar as something roughly the size of a pelican, and since there's no such thing as space pelicans flying at around 90,000 feet, it would most likely have been dismissed as a technical error. This is also when its speed and altitude became handy. Although the Soviets eventually learned how to detect the aircraft, they were largely incapable of reaching it, since it was far faster than a missile and its surface ceiling was higher than the Soviets' best interceptor. And then there was the hardware on board. The SR-71 was not built to carry armaments, and certainly didn't need any for defensive purposes. Instead, it contained electronic intelligence hardware, anti-missile and anti-interceptor measures, side-looking airborne radar, and specialized tracking and infrared cameras. The Blackbird used 2 cameras to provide stereo imaging across the plane's entire flight track, plus horizon-to-horizon coverage, while a specialized secondary camera could be focused in on a target area. Due to advancements in camera technology, the SR-71's ability to image its targets would greatly increase with time, and some of its other sensor technologies were upgraded as well. It was outfitted with a specialized life support system, plus water and snacks for the crew, who wore specialized protective suits that could keep them safe in the event of a high-altitude ejection. The Blackbird was a beast of an airplane, but it also required an immense amount from its pilots. Traveling 3,000 feet per second, pilots had to reimagine how they navigated the landscape, either with instruments or by using massive geographical features as their landmarks. Telling a pilot to, say, turn left at Cheyenne, Wyoming wasn't much good. They'd pass over all of Cheyenne in about 9 seconds, and with a turning radius of 100 miles, it made far more sense to tell the pilot to just turn when they hit the Rockies. Features like its delta wing and chines, sharp edges at either side of the fuselage, made it considerably more aerodynamic, but still nowhere near the ease of flying most modern planes. But although flying the Blackbird was incredibly challenging, it was also seen as a major privilege, a chance to do something that few people ever would. In the words of Colonel Jim Watkins, quote, "At 85,000 feet and Mach 3, it was almost a religious experience. Nothing had prepared me to fly that fast. My God, even now, I get goosebumps remembering." On a less poignant note, being a Blackbird pilot came with a guaranteed tasty breakfast. Because of the demands of flight, pilots were required to eat a so-called high-protein, low-residue meal before flying, which was, for the Air Force, steak and eggs. It's a testament both to the Blackbird's engineering and to the brave pilots that flew it that in over 30 years of operation, not a single plane out of 32 was ever shot down. Even after the Soviets had the Blackbird's number, even after they knew that it was out there, their best pilots and their best technology were just unable to do anything about it. The SR-71 entered the skies at just the right time to make a big impact in Vietnam, with the first planes arriving to Okinawa's Kadena Air Base in March of 1968. From there, the Blackbird was deployed over North Vietnam for thousands of flying hours and hundreds of operational missions. While the planes were barred from passing over Soviet airspace directly, they could and would go just about anywhere else. In the coming years, they would see action performing reconnaissance work anywhere that the US had a relevant interest. Blackbird intelligence was crucial during the Yom Kippur War, the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, the American incursions into Libya, the exposure of Silkworm missile batteries in Iran. And of course, it's not like those countries could do anything about the Blackbird hanging out in their airspace. And over a total of 53,500 total flight hours for the Blackbird family of planes, it grew a massive reputation around the world as a projection of the power of the American military. Initially, the Archangel project's planes were made public partly because of political pressure, with the US desperate to give an outward appearance that they were keeping up with the Soviets in terms of innovation. But once they were known around the world, the Blackbird took on a life of its own, both in the military and civilian circles. But the Blackbird wasn't a panacea to United States' intelligence troubles either. With only 32 planes to work with, the SR-71 program could only be in so many places at once, and each time a plane flew, it would require something around a week's worth of maintenance to just become airworthy again. Often, they would come back with some parts broken and other parts completely missing, and even when a plane was cleared to fly, it took up to a day to get the thing ready from hangar to runway. Even at peak efficiency, that meant only 4 planes could fly each day, and that was before natural delays, costs, and larger fixes were even accounted for. The larger issue, though, was the SR-71's troubling record of accidents, and when we're discussing a plane with this level of power and thrust, there was only a hair of difference between an innocuous error and certain death. Of the 32 Blackbirds that were built, 12 of them were lost to accidents. For example, one plane disintegrated in 1966 after an engine shut down in a high bank turn, killing the reconnaissance officer on board, Jim Zweyer. Several others suffered braking failures on the tarmac, causing the wheels to collapse and the entire plane to be damaged, while a 1989 flight over the South China Sea suffered engine explosions in what would be the Blackbird's final accident. Luckily, no crew member of an SR-71 except Jim Zweyer would ever be killed in an in-flight accident, but these equipment losses would equate to several $1 billion in today's money. This contributed to an expectation within the Blackbird program that, although the planes were incredible, they also posed a bit of a risk to anyone who flew them. In fact, there was one incident in which Soviet MiG-25 fighters even had the Blackbird at their mercy after an SR-71 suffered an engine explosion over Sweden and was locked onto by the Soviets. However, a couple of unnamed Swedish planes had beaten the MiGs there, and the planes were able to escort the Blackbird away from the Soviet threat without being harmed. Although this near-miss was an isolated incident, it was a massive reminder to the Air Force that the Blackbird's habit of system failure put it at risk of attacks that would have otherwise been impossible. It's also worth noting the Blackbirds weren't only employed by the US Air Force either, with 2 planes being loaned to NASA during the 1990s to conduct scientific research. Because of the sheer magnitude of what the Blackbird could do, it was a perfect platform to explore everything from extreme aerodynamics to thermal protection to studies on the surrounding atmosphere. The SR-71 also became a testbed for the Iridium satellite communications system, which was instrumental in developing technology like modern cell phones. And all throughout history, the SR-71 contributed to scientific advancements like ramjet engines, survival systems, and huge advancements in material science, many of which have gone on to be used in a whole range of modern technologies. Before we see the SR-71 through the end of its service life, let's take a moment just to honor some of the truly incredible records that it set as the fastest, highest flying jet aircraft that the world has ever seen. A flight taken in 1976 set the record for the highest ever sustained horizontal flight at an altitude of 85,069 feet, and another flight on the same day set the absolute speed record for a manned jet aircraft, 2,193 miles per hour. Or if you prefer, it holds the speed record for a trip from London to New York, which was completed in under an hour and 55 minutes. It also completed its final flight, a transcontinental journey from California to Washington, D.C. in a little bit over an hour. By the late 1980s, the operators of the Blackbird program understood that their beloved plane's time was coming to a close. Although there were no faster, higher flying planes in development to replace it, well, there didn't really need to be. Spy satellites were doing a better job and doing it more cheaply than the SR-71 could in most circumstances, and the US really didn't have any new adversaries who would demand the sort of supersonic spycraft that the Blackbird offered. With the Cold War quickly coming to a close, the Air Force was transparent and open that it just couldn't justify the cost of the Blackbird anymore. Officials cited advancements in Soviet ground-to-air technology and new interceptors, the emergence of unmanned aerial vehicles, and even the potential alternate uses of the Blackbird's funding, all as reasons not to keep the program. There's been speculation after the fact that Pentagon politics and congressional ignorance about the Blackbird's capabilities might have also been a factor. But regardless, the SR-71 was retired in 1989. But that retirement was not without its caveats. Congress decided to keep 6 of the planes, plus a trainer model, in a state of partial readiness that could put them in the skies within 2 months of reactivation. In the following years after the plane was retired, high-ranking officials like General Norman Schwarzkopf Jr. were frustrated by its absence, as it could have been extremely useful during Operation Desert Storm in the Middle East and to gather intelligence on emerging threats in Bosnia and North Korea. During those years, the limitations of satellite intelligence began to frustrate US officials, and while the remaining U-2 fleet and newer drones were doing a decent job, none of those aircraft were nearly as good as the Blackbird. 3 of the planes were reactivated for a short couple of years, but eventually political pressure again became too much. After their brief return to the skies, the SR-71 fleet was permanently retired in 1998, with the 2 last Blackbirds working with NASA joining them a year later. Today, the Blackbird fleet sits mostly in museums in the US and Europe, although NASA still retains custody of 2 of the aircraft. Both as a testament to the truly visionary nature of the planes and of the way their capabilities have become less important with time, neither the United States nor any other nation has developed a known successor craft. A stealth UAV made by Northrop Grumman known as the RQ-180 is believed to be operating in the skies today, but its existence is not acknowledged by the United States. Even if it was, it's not believed to operate anywhere near the Blackbird service ceiling or its top speed. After the release of the movie Top Gun Maverick, Lockheed Martin have made some cheeky references to a crude air-breathing jet aircraft that could go faster than the Blackbird, and the movie's fictional Dark Star aircraft is believed to resemble plans for a plane known as the SR-72. But this remains just speculation, even if the press team at Lockheed are feeding into it. Without any known successor, the SR-71 is today the undisputed, albeit retired, king of the skies. Its legacy as the fastest, highest-flying jet plane in the world is untouched, and it may well be generations before something else even comes close.